Well, good afternoon. I'm glad that y'all were able to join us. My name is Jeremiah Best. I'm the educator for New York Agriculture in the Classroom. Thank you for joining us in beautiful New York. And we're here in the Sugar Bush. Last week or last two weeks ago, we were in the Adirondacks in the high peaks, and we were at another sugar bush, and we noticed that we didn't have much sap flow. And now all of a sudden we're in this beautiful, we have this beautiful weather. We've been below zero for so long, and we have this beautiful weather, and all of a sudden we're seeing sap flow. So we came here to Mapleland Farms to talk to Mr. Campbell about why we're having this maple, why we're having maple flow, what is the maple industry, how do you make maple syrup? So welcome, how are you? I noticed there's some mountains in the back. Can you tell us what those mountains are?
Right behind me are the Green Mountains of Vermont. We're about 5 miles from the Vermont border. And on the other side of behind Mr. Best is Adirondack Mountains, where we get a view of also.
So, Mr. Campbell, how did you get started? We're here in between the mountains in New York and the mountains of Vermont. Did you always do maple syrup since you're a young man? How did you get started? Tell us a little bit about the history of Mapleland Farms.
Well, our forefathers came to this part of the world in the 1850s. There was always maple trees on the farm. They probably made a little syrup for their own use. When I was a young kid, we took the sap from a few of our trees down to my grandparents' farm, not far from here. They made us a little bit of syrup in return. And in 1972, when I was 12 or 13, we started as a family making syrup commercially on this property here. And today, my brother Terry and I carry on the family operation. And first year we commercially made syrup here, we had 600 buckets that we had hanging out to collect the sap. And now we have production from 18,000 trees, all on pipeline to connect the trees to the holding tanks.
So as we start to talk about how we get that sap from the trees to get it into a bottle, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. Please be respectful of other attendees. That chat's there for questions. You can raise your hand, or if you see a question you like, you can give a thumbs up. So we're talking about trees. How do we get the trees? We need a few things. We need sun, trees, water, soil. How do we get sap, and how do we get it from the tree into our evaporators, or into our trucks, or into our sugar house?
So the sap we're collecting right now is from the sugar the tree produced from its leaves last summer, and then send it down to their trunk to the roots and stored it in their roots all winter long. And in the springtime, the tree is bringing that sap back up to energize the bugs to make the leaves come out this spring and summer. So we're drilling a little hole in the tree to put a spout to collect a little bit of the sap. And originally they started with wooden spouts, then they moved on to metal spouts that they could hang a bucket on. And now we use a whole series of pipeline up through the woodlot to collect the sap. We start that process of putting the taps in the tree first of the year to get anticipating the warm weather coming in the spring. And once the warm weather comes and you start to get thawing days and freezing nights, that sap up and down in the tree and bring the sugar up that we can collect.
So we're here in the middle of some fields, and where do you get how do you get your maple to your sugar shack? And a sugar shack what is a sugar shack?
Sugar shack is the building that we boil the syrup, and the sap comes here by a truck to get from all our holding tanks. We have our biggest wood lot is 5 miles away from here, and then some of the trees here right by the sugar house actually travel downhill through pipes about a mile to get to the holding tank that collects them. So once the tanks get filled up, we start loading the trucks and hauling the sap here.
So we took a drive a little earlier to see your sugar bush, or a sugar bush is a group of maple trees, and we see a delivery coming in now. You just don't have pipes going straight to your sugar shack, but you have to have your sap delivered, correct?
Right. We haul all our sap, unlike some producers that have their sugar shack at the base of the hill. But our trees are spread out over a large area.
So is this a family operation that you run?
Right. My brother and I are the owners of the operation. And then we have, all depending on the time of the year, 5 or 6 employees that help us out with all the different aspects of the operation. Right now, today we have 3 guys that are working in the woods, and their job today is to look for leaks that are out in the woods, whether a branch fell down on a line, pulled it apart, or a squirrel or some other animal chewed on the line. So it takes a lot of labor between putting all the taps in, maintaining the pipes, installing new pipes, and then pulling the taps out of the trees at the end of the season so the tree can heal up that little wound that we put in it and be ready for the next season.
So can you tell us a little bit about what he's doing now?
So he has a 2,000-gallon tank on that truck that he has picked up at the wood lot, and now he's hooking up for pumping the truck back off into our holding tank. He's pumping into a 5,000-gallon holding tank, which feeds a reverse osmosis machine, which we'll see inside. And then from the reverse osmosis machine, it comes back out to another tank. And from there, it gets fed into the evaporator for the final boiling process.
So right now we've collected the sap out of the woods, and now he's pumping it into, would these be large holding tanks?
Right. And besides 2 tanks for holding sap, we have a couple of tanks that are holding the permeate, which is the purified water that we're extracting out of the sap, and we use that water for washing the reverse osmosis machines and any other equipment at the end of the day.
And I gotta say, there's a reason that we have 5 senses, and I don't know if y'all can see the steam coming out from the evaporator, but if you were here, it's about 55 degrees. It's been a ton of snow and been below freezing for probably the last 2 months. And it smells like caramel. So imagine being in this field, and for a mile away or so, you could smell sweet caramel and sugar. That's the experience that we're having today. We have the beautiful Green Mountains behind us. So we have collected the sap. We have taken the sap from the woods, brought it to our sugar house. Can we go inside? You discussed RO. What is RO? Quickly, can you tell us what that means?
Reverse osmosis is what they call the machine, which you pump the sap through a series of membranes under 400 pounds pressure, and that the membrane is built so that it will separate the water molecules from the other molecules. Water molecules are smaller than sugar and other minerals, so we're taking the sap that's coming out of the trees today at about 2% sugar, and the reverse osmosis is pushing it up to about 20% sugar. and we have to get it to the 67% sugar for the finished product of maple syrup.
So we're going to go in and take a look at that. But as we have this beautiful caramel smell surrounding us like a blanket, and we have the beautiful green Vermont mountains behind us, I think this would be a great opportunity to take any questions. I definitely want to give a shout out to all those schools across the nation, especially Dryden Elementary and Freeville Elementary. Thank you for joining us. Did you have any local schools that you would like to say hello to?
I know Cambridge and Greenwich and Argyle, I believe, are tuned in today.
Well, thank you.
Say hello to them.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us. And Miss Carpenter, do we have any questions?
We do. We have so many great questions. Before we get into learning more about your super filter, the reverse osmosis machine, we want to just ask a couple questions that our students have sent in. So we are wondering, is there a special side of the tree that you need to tap the tree from, or can you tap from any side of the tree?
We tap every side of the tree and utilize all the tree. Early in the season, the sap might flow a little better, warm up quicker on the south side of the tree or east side. Late in the season, it's going to run better on the north side of the tree. So over the whole season, it averages out, but it all comes from the same core of the tree.
So Leah wants to know, how do you know which trees have sap? How do you know which ones to tap?
Well, you have to learn each tree species to find out which ones are the maple trees. All the maple trees will give you sap. The sugar maple has the sweetest sap, but to differentiate all the trees, they all have a different shape and roughness of bark, and their twig shape is a little bit different. So it's a whole learning your tree process to know which ones to tap.
And Mr. Campbell, Caleb really wants to know, and we have quite a few questions about this. Just to reiterate for us, what is the best time or the only time of the year that you can get sap from a maple tree?
The best time of the year is right now in the early springtime. You can get sap from a tree anytime during the winter that you have a freezing and thawing situation happen. Although early in the winter, the sap is not nearly as sweet as it is this time of year because the sugar's stored down in the roots, where this time of the year, the tree is bringing that sugar up from the roots and making the sap that's moving in the tree a lot sweeter. In the summer, the tree is just, when the leaves are on, using photosynthesis to make the sugars and move them down to the roots to store them for the next year.
So that's so great. So we do have some questions. Some of our students were able to receive a piece of tubing and a tap to explore. Some of our students got that. How much tubing do you use in your sugar bush to get the sap from the trees to your holding tank?
We figure on average it takes about 20-25 feet of tubing for each tap, and you multiply that by 18,000. I think we figure we have probably 8 or 9 miles or maybe more in the woods.
That's incredible.
And well, and that's a lot of miles for our help to walk and check for leaks several times during the season.
That is a lot of miles to walk, and checking and touching every single inch of that tubing is pretty incredible. Well, we can't wait to see what's inside the sugar house. You can see the outside of Mr. Campbell's sugar house here. He and his family been making sugar here for a long time. It's a beautiful day in Salem, New York. And now we're going to walk in and see where his syrup is made. you'll start to see all these big silver barrels have syrup inside of them, or they will have syrup inside of them. Because they make so much here, it doesn't go right into the beautiful little bottles you might buy at the store. It goes into these big barrels first, and we'll learn more about those. So we are going to follow Mr. Campbell right into his very special room called the reverse osmosis room.
So this is one of our 3 reverse osmosis machines we have. It has this high pressure pumps down here that builds the pressure to 400 pounds. And then it puts it through the membranes, which are inside these housings, where it will separate out those water molecules and the sugar molecules. So before it goes into these machines, it goes through filters to filter it down to 5 microns of any dirt particles that might come in the sap. And
it's a pretty impressive space. And this filter is pretty important to you, isn't it?
yes, it is one of the main things we use here to do the concentrating. If we didn't have the reverse osmosis machine, we'd have to boil on our evaporator more than 24 hours a day to keep up with the sap flow that we get here. So,
well, that's pretty incredible. So this super filter is essential to a sugar maker's operation, and it's pretty interesting to see that you have a special room dedicated just to this.
well, yes, with the membranes in these machines can't freeze or it will damage them. So we have to give this machine a special heated room to keep it warm.
Now, once the sap comes from the tree, it goes into the truck. The truck brings it here to your sugar house. You move that sap, and that sap really just tastes like nothing until you move it through. It just tastes kind of like water because you can't really taste the sugar in it. Is that right?
Very, very little sweetness. You can taste just a hint of sweetness to it, but not like syrup.
Now, after it goes through this RO, you say that there's a lot more sugar in it. So do you think you can taste the sweetness in the sap after it goes through the reverse osmosis?
Definitely, it's very sweet and ready for the boiling process.
All right. And so what comes next after it goes through this RO and gets a little bit more sweeter?
So then it goes back to a holding tank till we get ready to start our evaporator, and then we bring it in through this float box here, and that controls the level in this pan, keeps it flowing and full all the time. And this large pan has a couple sections in it, and it goes through this next float box, and that controls the levels in this front pan here. And that's where we get the finished product, is after it flows all through all these channels and gets boiled and concentrated into the finished syrup.
So this big machine, your evaporator, when somebody wants to know, do you only have one of these?
We only have one of these evaporators. We have a large one. Some bigger operations might have 2 smaller ones. All depends on the size of the operator. And this one, usually you'll handle the sap flow from about 4 or 5 hours on a big day. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 hours if we only have a little sap flow for the day. And as it goes through each of those channels, it's getting a little more water cooked out of it all the way through. The finished syrup usually comes off around 219 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the barometric pressure that day. And then we check that with a hydrometer to make sure the density is right for that day. And then it's filtered and goes into a barrel for storage.
And so what we're seeing right now, that's not smoke coming off, that's steam, because there's a lot of water in sap. So we have to get all of that water out of the sap to make it into that really dark, beautiful syrup that we like on our pancakes. Is that right?
Right. Depending on the sugar content coming out of the tree, it'll take about 40 or 50 gallons of that sap from the tree to make 1 gallon of syrup. So we're either taking it out, that extra water out with a reverse osmosis machine, or it's evaporating out in the steam. And the reason we do the boiling process, because probably make some syrup with just a series of reverse osmosis machines, but it would end up not having any flavor. And the sap needs to go through a boiling process to get those sugars caramelized to give it those colors and flavors that you'll have.
So Livy really wants to know, in this process here, when you're boiling it down, how long does it take to make 1 gallon of syrup in your evaporator?
In our evaporator, we can make, after you get everything warmed up and going, around 80 gallons of syrup in an hour because of the size of it. If it was smaller, you wouldn't make as much per hour.
So after your sap moves through all these pans and gets boiled down into syrup, then what happens? How do you know that it really is syrup and not just some really dark sap?
So we watch these thermometers to tell the temperature, and then when it gets to the temperature we think it should be, we fill this test cup and use our hydrometer here to test the density of the syrup. It's not quite syrup yet because it's not floating as high as it should. It should float on that line right there at the level of syrup if it was the right density for finished syrup.
So that's a really important tool. You're taking that sap that's coming out is really hot. It's 200. It was 214 degrees, and now that's getting pretty close to the time where it should be syrup. But you're thinking it needs just a little bit longer to cook.
Right. Usually around 219 or 220, depending on the barometric pressure that day, is how you get your finished syrup density right. And then once we get some in this holding tank of syrup, we'll then pump it through this pump and these series of filters. There's a whole series of paper filters here that syrup has to go through that collects any minerals or impurities. It's a little bit cloudy when it's finished because we have taken around 40 or 50 gallons of sap and solidified the minerals and condensed them into 1 gallon of syrup. So we are filtering out all that cloudiness to give you a nice, clear, finished product.
So Mr. Campbell, Kashan wants to know, have you ever been burned while you've been boiling down your sap?
If you're not careful and get some of that hot syrup on your hand, you definitely get burned. I have. And even the steam coming off the inside the evaporator is at 212 degrees also. So you can also get a steam burn.
Yeah, so there's some pretty dangerous things if you're not careful, because you're cooking this at a pretty high temperature and for a long time. So yeah, those are really great questions about safety, and you have to be really careful when you're doing this type of work. So I think this filter is really interesting. So, you know, you've filtered it once already with the super filter and the reverse osmosis. But then after you boil it, that syrup before we eat it has to be filtered again. So that machine that you see without looks like handles on top of it, that's your last filter process. And then where does the syrup go from there after it gets pushed through those really thick, like coffee filter type material?
So here at our farm, because we're making so much and never know what size container our customers are going to want, we put it in these stainless 40-gallon drums, and it goes in there probably about 200 degrees. And once you put the cap on them, they seal right up as they cool, and we can store them for a year or two until we need them to bottle into the container that the customer wants. And
Yeah,
then
that's
besides
really
the finished syrup, we had a maple sugar candies, maple cream spread, even some maple cotton candy different times during the year.
wow. So somebody wants to know, one of our students, I'm sorry, I will give you a shout out if I find it, but they want to know, can you make sap out of anything else? Not just the syrup, but can you make sap? Can you only make maple syrup with it?
You can only make maple syrup out of the maple tree, but you can make birch syrup out of white birch trees, butternuts and walnut syrup out of those trees. Those sap from those trees isn't nearly as sweet, so it takes at least 80 to 100 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup from those trees. So there are people doing it, but we just are focused on the maple syrup at our farm.
So Mrs. Turk's classroom wants to know, the syrup they received was more of a dark syrup. How does syrup change in color through the season? Why is some syrup dark and some light?
Yes, the syrup does change in color during the season, sometimes from day to day. It all depends on the temperatures and sugar contents of the sap. We are currently making the lighter amber and golden syrups early in the season. When the temperature's colder, the sap is sweeter. As the season progresses, we go into the darker, stronger flavored syrups. The sugar coming out of the trees at the very end of the season is usually down around 1%. So then we're making takes about 80 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup, and all that extra processing will darken and strengthen the flavor of the syrup.
Do you have any samples you could show us about how you bottle your product? Our students are really interested about how you go from those big drums to how do you get them in the beautiful bottles we see and buy at the store or on a farm?
So these are samples of some of the bottles we pack in. We have a kitchen set up in the basement of my house where we have a bottling and candy making set up. So we reheat the syrup to 180 or 85 degrees and then fill all these containers, and then they seal up and are ready for sending out to all our distribution points. We do internet sales all across the country and sell a lot to local stores as well as restaurants, and so it's available widely.
Your packaging is really beautiful. Did you create the image on your labels?
My sister-in-law took the photograph of our backside of our sugar house in woods, and we had somebody turn it into a watercolor, and then we turned it into a label. Worked with our local graphic artist.
Well, I think
And
it's really
those are some
interesting.
of our maple sugar candies. And to make the candies, you boil the syrup even further and take it up to a higher temperature, take out another little bit of water to make it even sweeter and make it so it'll form those shapes.
That's pretty amazing that it's not just the liquid syrup, but so many other things: maple cotton candy, maple sugar cakes, maple cream. It's really amazing all the different things, delicious things we can do with syrup. So now we've kind of seen the whole process. From the woods to the truck to going through the reverse osmosis, being boiled down, checking to make sure it really is syrup, filtering, bottling. We wanted to just do some popcorn questions in our last few minutes that we have together. We have some really great questions. So Ms. Della's class wants to know, does it hurt the trees to tap them?
No, it doesn't hurt the tree as long as you don't put too many tap holes in the tree. Most of our trees only get one hole, maybe two if they're very big trees. Then as soon as we pull the spout out at the end of the season, the tree heals that little hole over just like it was a wound you have on your body. It makes a scar and heals over, and within a year or two, you'll never hardly see that hole. Just a little, looks like a little scab. So
Samira has a
some of the trees in our woods are probably 150 years old, and some of them that we've been tapping here since the early 70s are still very productive.
Samira wants to know, if you can, could you estimate about how many trees you've tapped all the years that you've been making maple syrup?
You mean how many I have tapped personally in each year?
Sure, yeah, if you can.
It's been a growing process. So like I said earlier, the first year we had 600 buckets. And in 2005, when we bought our first reverse osmosis machine, we had about 4,000 taps, and we've been steadily growing since then till about 18,000 now. And I used to do a lot of the tapping, but now I have some other guys that are doing most of the tapping. They're younger and more ambitious in the woods, and I'm busy with the bottling and candy making part of the operation, and I do all the syrup making. So we all, as it's grown, we've all specialized in different jobs in the business.
So we have a few questions from one of our classrooms. Michaela wants to know, how much sap can you fit in a bucket? If you were using a bucket system, we know you're using a vacuum system with tubes, but how about how much sap fits in a bucket, and how long does it take to fill that bucket?
There's different size buckets. These here in the video right now are about 2 gallons, I believe. Some of them are a little smaller, and it all depends on the day, what kind of sap flow you get from the tree. If you have a really good day, the tree will fill that bucket in a day. Sometimes it takes several days, but you depend on how warm the weather is. You don't want to let the sap sit around for very long, or it might sour on you because of the sugar in it. So we try to process each day sap as it comes in so that we don't lose any quality.
So Zoe wants to know, remember, we have friends from across the country who are with us today. Does it get really cold there? It looks like there's snow and mountains.
It does get very cold here. Depends on the year. This year was colder than last year. And our season has started later this year because of that. Last year, we actually made maple syrup in January, which this year we didn't make any till the very end of February because we had so much cold and snow.
And Aiden wants to know, is there ever a time where you would tap a maple tree and there would be no sap in it?
Yeah, usually in the summertime, there shouldn't be any sap because the tree is busy growing and putting the sugar down to its roots. You might get a few drops, but you wouldn't get the volume you get now when it's trying to energize itself for the spring growth.
We have another question from Roxy. She wants to know, do you add any sugar to the sap to make it sweet? And if you do, or do you add anything to your syrup to make it sweet?
We do not add anything, but all the sweetness is natural sugars right from the maple tree. There's nothing ever added to it. It's just the water taken out to condense it and sweeten it.
And so some of our students have questions about the difference between like the Aunt Jemima pancake syrup that they can find in the grocery store and real maple syrup. What's the difference between that bottle of Aunt Jemima or Mrs. Butterworth and the syrup that you make?
Our syrup is 100% from the maple tree. Some of those other syrups are using a corn syrup base, and then some artificial flavoring and coloring to make it look and taste a little bit like maple syrup.
And so our last question of today, we've had such a nice time visiting your farm, and our students really want to know, what do you like most about your job making maple syrup?
I like being able to be outside in the nature and the woods and enjoying the open space that we have here, and making a quality product for all you people to enjoy.
Well, we love your maple syrup. It's one of my favorite syrups, and I come from a land with a whole lot of syrup. So we cannot thank you and Mapleland Farms and your brother and Miss Packer for the time that they spent organizing our virtual field trip today. We're so lucky to get to visit you. So thank you from New York Ag in the Classroom and all of our students and teachers who joined us from across the country.
Yeah, thanks for coming here. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.